Hello and welcome to Clinical Changemakers. Today on the show we have Dr. Sharen Paine. She is a doctorate in business administration with a focus on cybernetics, systems thinking, and is a management expert. Dr. Sharen Paine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I'm really excited to have this conversation. I read some of your papers online about the viable system model, and what really resonated with me was this approach to understanding organisational systems and structures, and how this approach can help us unearth and clearly articulate the challenges we have, and also some opportunities to solve them. I think in particular, from a clinician standpoint, you go and work in a clinic or a hospital or what have you, and you're very much focused on the patient care and the day-to-day work that you're doing. As you get more senior, you start to understand the sort of operational context that you're in, and then more senior still, the financial context. But often it seems quite rigid, or like it's always been there. It's the structure that someone super clever came up with 30 years ago, and that's just the way things work, until you go through a restructure. And then you realize, wow, this was maybe more of a house of cards than I anticipated. And then why are we moving these things around? What does that mean for me and my patients and the way that I work? And from going through a restructure currently, I've still had those same sorts of feelings. How do we know what component fits where and who does what? How does this sit in an overall strategy? What are the best practices and concepts to understand in this space? And that's where I found reading your work really, really helpful and grounding. And that's what I'd love to talk about today. Before we go into your journey into this space, supporting a clinical service, I wondered if we could spend a little bit of time just understanding some of the fields that you're bringing to the space. That is the field of cybernetics and systems thinking.
Sure. So cybernetics is described as the communication and control in the animal and machine. And essentially it is about the flow of information through a system to manage and control the behaviours of that system. So we can think of, in a mechanical sense, the autopilot function on an aircraft. And so the aircraft has sensors all over it, and it's gathering information that is helping it to make decisions about how it sets its flight path and so on, and helping it to respond to its environment by giving it feedback on what's actually what the impacts of its changes are. And so it's that continual flow of information and the communicating of that in an effective way that helps to control behaviours, to control the system. And so in an organisational sense, controlling, what we typically see is command and control. We don't see a system set up whereby we have the sensors on the organisation that can help us understand, completely and in the right time, what the organisation, what the system is doing, and how we need to respond to that to keep us heading towards whatever our goal or purpose is.
And I just want to linger on the command and control thing. Are you able to elaborate a little bit more on what that sort of looks and feels like, and perhaps are there moments where that is a good model and obviously other times where it's not so much?
So even in any kind of, if we're thinking of an organisation, there will be some directives, if you like, that come down through the system, some basic sort of fundamentals of how the organisation needs to function to help maintain its coherence and cohesion. The problem is when we get commands from the top, higher levels down to a lower level, that where the person or the system, the mechanism making that command doesn't understand in enough detail what's happening at that lower level to be able to determine what should happen. And so we don't have what we want to have in a system is the lower levels being able to make the decisions that they need to make, because they are right close to the problem, they have the information to make it, but accepting that there will be this sort of higher level standards or parameters within which they need to work. So the command and control is typically one-way down flow of information, whereas we want a two-way flow of communication so that we have a better understanding through the levels of an organisation up through those levels of what's actually happening, and we can make decisions closer to the ground.
Yeah, I think there is a very common culture and perspective from clinical practitioners on the front line that disconnect is vast, and
Yes.
that there is a command and control type of thinking. And when you look at the health systems more generally and national health systems and things like that, I can see how that can happen, particularly around restructures and new people and all those sorts of things. And then also really busy frontline, just trying to get through the day-to-day complexity that is confronting them, and therefore, supporting and building and understanding those structures to maybe mature them or enhance them is just kind of out of your sphere of influence. And so it feels like at times we just go from system to system, replicating elements of that same overarching ethos. Obviously, New Zealand and other countries around the world have done many health reforms and restructures, and perhaps haven't necessarily really unrooted that particular ethos, as I said. What I wanted to do was to talk a little bit to you, ask you a little bit about your journey into this space, because I think you didn't necessarily just come in from, again, on high with this concept and kind of throw it at the health system. You're actually there learning and discovering elements of this. I wondered if you could talk to what that journey was like.
Sure. So just to be clear, I don't have a clinical background. My first sort of foray into health was about 30 years ago, actually, in specialist mental health services. And I was somewhat shocked, I suppose. From the outside, you look into a health service and you expect that it functions well and everything happens deliberately and for a reason. But what I saw was almost, a chaotic situation, and things that was somewhat haphazard. And then when I started working more recently with the ophthalmology service here in Christchurch, I essentially saw that overall in the health system, things hadn't really got that much better. We hadn't established some principles and progressed. As you say, we keep going around this sort of loop of learning and unlearning, and it was still like that. And the reason I got involved with ophthalmology was that they had, very long and overdue wait lists for follow-up. So that was the starting point. And the view of the Ministry of Health at that point, who provided some funding for this work because it was a nationwide issue, was that they would put some resources in to enable extra clinics to get rid of the backlog, and then all would be well. And my view of that was that's all very well, but why did this problem happen in the first place, and what's to stop it happening again? And so we worked through a process over quite a lengthy period of time of really understanding how the service functioned, what information they had and didn't have, how they defined their clinical services, and so on and so forth. And because of this disconnect between the levels of the system, and we struggled to get traction to actually do any development to get the things done that we wanted to have done, I was getting somewhat frustrated with it and thought I can't keep working in a system where we don't make progress, over time, which is why I started to I undertook the doctorate and came across the viable system model. And when I came across that, it struck me as quite sort of making sense. And so I thought I would see how did that model apply or fit with what we had come up with in ophthalmology just through looking at what the service needed. And so I found it to be a really good fit. We had identified most of the parts. We had different emphasis on some parts. What we had come up with was certainly not as elegant as the viable system model and wasn't as entirely complete. But there was nothing in the viable system model that you would look at it and say, well, actually, you don't need that. So that's how I came to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting story, sort of a bottom-up type of approach and really hands-on, which I think helps to sort of ground out the real challenges. One thing I wanted to pick up on was maybe some reflections on that clinical operational framework that that you guys are working through, because I think there's a couple of comments that you said that I think superficially clinicians and other healthcare providers might say, oh, of course we know what service we're doing. Of course we know what patients we're seeing and the medicines, and I see that person in that room there, and I do the surgery there, and that's what I do. But I think once you sort of hold our feet to the flames, and this is no shade on anybody, it's just a reality, really scrutinizing what we are doing often doesn't get the light of day, and we often don't have the support to do so. So I just wondered, what were the reflections that you had when you were pulling together that clinical operational sort of framework? What were those components that were required to build that, and what did you learn, particularly maybe from a clinician's perspective when you were doing that engagement?
So the framework was very much developed with ophthalmology and with mainly the service manager and the clinical director. And the clinical director had she was a really good systems thinker, and she was totally interested in doing this work. And I didn't quite know exactly where it was going to go. No one did really, but it was through discussions when we talked about how they defined their clinical streams and how they worked and how they operated them, and then I might say, well, do we have models of care for that? Have you described in enough detail how that functions? And no, we hadn't. So would go through that process, and then that would bring up. For instance, we looked at diabetic retinal screening and said, well, we can have some clinics, for virtual clinics, if you like, where patients come in, they have their tests, and then the ophthalmologist will go through the results and then call people back if they're necessary, and then the ophthalmologist can get through many more patients in the time. And so then we thought, well, if we're going to do it for that, why can't we do that for some other services, and why don't we start to think differently about the way that we provide these services to make them flow better, to make sure we get patients through on time, to use our resources more effectively. And it was just the willingness of the clinical director to start to have those thoughts, to start to challenge what they do and how they do it, because her responsibility at the end of the day was to have the service working and to get through get patients in on time and be seen appropriately. So it was a really rewarding process to go through for me and for the service and for the people in it, to start to think and see to think about how they do things, and to sort of look at things from a slightly different perspective. And you're right that typically there is no time for that sort of thinking to happen. People are just busy dealing with the day-to-day.
And I'll be curious in terms of what the workflow and operational outcomes look like. I know we're trying to maybe getting into too much of the detail, but I'm just really curious about how this then sort of embeds, and I'm making things up here, does that mean that every week there is a particular operations meeting that is now informed by leading and lagging indicators that the clinician can now support and understand, and the service manager can also support and understand? What did it sort of turn into?
Well, that's what we were trying to get towards. One of the main areas we were trying to develop was a production planning system tool that they could use to allow them to adjust clinics and the clinics they ran to meet the demand, so that they weren't running clinics that were half empty because they weren't really needed, and the way they had been working was that a clinic schedule would be established at the beginning of the year, and that it would stay like that because there was no sort of mechanism to change it. So we were setting this up so that we had that flexibility, and we could adapt essentially to what the demand was coming through. And we struggled to get the production planning system up and running. It needs a huge amount of detail, and we got closer to it, but the production planning group was given other priorities, and they were really working with us as a favour almost. And so we didn't get the traction we needed on that. And then by the time the production planning people and others looked at what we were doing, they were thinking, oh, well, actually, we could just roll this out across all areas. But what they hadn't understood was that in order to get to the point where you can do production planning, you need to understand a huge amount about what you're doing and how you're doing it and what resources you need and so on and so forth. And so that sort of fell by the wayside, and that was the point at which they said, oh, well, we can do this now without you. So the work that we did sort of helped them a lot, because they got to a point where they knew exactly what their sort of situation was. But then beyond that, we'd struggled to get the DHB to move that forward. And again, this disconnect between the levels and the lack of understanding of higher levels of the detail that you need to get into at the lower levels hindered what we were trying to do.
Yeah, and you've spoken about that that disconnect from sort of governance, which is that policy, purpose and ethos, the management, which is the setting up the conditions for delivery, and then operations, which is the delivery of services. And it sounds like even with the progress that you made, there was a disconnect in sort of fulfilling what you were trying to achieve. If you were given more, I don't know, time or resource or what have you, was it more just maturing the production model and embedding it that you would have liked to have finished off, or were there other parts to this evolution which would also be a part of that enhancement?
So certainly finishing off that production planning element would have been a great benefit and very satisfying. But also, it comes back to this command and control thing. What I found really frustrating was, even if you put in all of the effort and understanding about what the situation was in the department, and given what they were there to achieve, and that we looked through how to do that as effectively as possible. And the organisation might talk about wanting to innovate and so on, but when it came down to it, there were just no it was the flat, no, there are no resources to do anything. And so if I could, in my ideal world, we would have a much better collaborative approach between the levels in the system to really understand what the people on the front line are dealing with, what they're tasked with, the resources they have to do that, and what that enables them to do and doesn't enable them to do. And so rather than sort of, just throwing down a command, taking a much more realistic and honest approach to understanding what's required to deliver the services that we think. And so, we want to bring the espoused purpose of the organisation as close as possible to the actual delivery, to the actual realisation of that purpose. And the system at the moment is certainly not set up to do that.
And there have been attempts to try and bridge those connections through, clinical governance and other sorts of governance groups to try to push and pull things up and down that chain. Also, there's sort of the quality improvement movement, which is attempting to, empower clinicians to fix the problems that they see in front of them. Why do you see that those things have perhaps not quite got the traction to then actually fulfill what we were hoping they could do?
So I think with quality improvement first, it typically, for some reason, it's been set outside of the work that people do. So it's seen as an extra thing, and it will often focus on individual projects in a somewhat ad hoc fashion. And then when the solutions, for that particular problem are arrived at, they're not fully embedded back into a well-functioning system, partly because there is no well-functioning system to embed them back into. And so we end up with all these bits and pieces just sort of tacked on to this rather flimsy way of operating in the first place. And invariably, over time, they fall by the wayside, or they were in conflict with some other thing that was happening in the system. And so it's this lack of a sort of fully resolved landscape of functioning that we really can see and understand, and we have a model of, that hinders that. And then clinical governance, there was one paper by Brennan and Flynn out of Ireland that described one of the major issues with clinical governance is that it's just sort of this amorphous thing, concept, and they broke it down into governance, management, and operations, and looking at the different kind of functions that need to take place in each of those areas to complete clinical governance as a whole. And from my point of view, that's absolutely right, and that the concept of clinical governance needs to be woven into, again, this sort of landscape of functioning where we understand, in terms of the work that I did, it was having the clinical director and the service manager looking at how do we, what's the direction and purpose of this service, what are our values and our culture, which should fit in with the levels above. Then they had responsibility in terms of management to understand what does a good quality service mean in terms of the service that we provide? What are the characteristics of it? How do we build those into our service delivery and operational functioning? And then at the operational level, making sure those things happen and monitoring that they do and so forth. So that clinical governance, and quality improvement and clinical governance aren't things that sit apart from the operation of the system. They should be totally embedded in it and happening all the time.
Yeah, just reflecting on the clinical governance point, I think there is something there about, the clinicians having the training and the skills. It's not just you're the most senior person in a department, get together with some more senior people and have an agenda and things. It's actually more than that, and not only more than that in terms of what they do and their terms of reference and remit and outputs, but then how they feed into that overall system. I really like what you said there. That these initiatives, programs of work, they can't be seen as external to the overarching purpose of an organisation. That is to learn and to listen and to be transparent about how those things occur. I wanted to jump to the viable system model, and just sort of go slowly through it, because I think it's a really fascinating model. And when I'll be honest, my first pass at it, I knew there was something in here that I hadn't known and I really sort of connected to, but I did struggle to understand it at kind of first pass. I wanted to linger on the word viable. What does viability mean in this context?
So viability is the ability of a system to persist, or an organisation or an organism to persist over time in the context of its environment. That's viable. If it can learn and adapt and change with its environment over time, it will be viable. If it can't learn and adapt, if it can't deal with the environment that it's part of, is going to collapse.
And I think health systems most likely globally are facing these dual challenges around constant change, either politically, financial, medically, or what have you, workforces, and then complexity. We are just getting more and more sophisticated with how we manage care, and then how we coordinate and look after people. And people as individuals, we are all complex beings in and of ourselves, and so there is a real challenge for how we overcome it. And when we look at things like productivity and spending, it all seems like we're not getting the enhanced outputs that perhaps we feel we should be, given the amount of effort maybe we're putting in. The viable system model, if you were to sort of break it down into some components, what would you ask people to kind of visualize there?
So it's quite difficult to do this without a diagram, but I'll do my best. So the viable system model says that for any organisation to be viable, to remain viable, it has to have 5 subsystems or functions in operation continuously and adequately, and the communication channels, information flows between them also working. So it's very much describing a system that is, I was going to say alive, that it's very much aware of itself, and that it's aware of its environment, and it's getting information from its environment about how it needs to adapt. And so the 5 basic functions in it are governance, which is about understanding the purpose of the organisation, and its identity and ethos and values and so on, setting that. So that's system 5 is governance. System 4 is sort of intelligence or strategy and planning. It's the long-term view of what we need to do to maintain ourselves over the long term. System 3 is about management control. So it's managing, setting up the conditions for our operational areas, which are going to deliver our purpose, setting up the conditions for those to be successful. So that's 5, 4, and 3. And then system the system ones are the operational areas within that organisation that deliver whatever the organisation exists to do to achieve its purpose. And then system two, coordination, is about ensuring that the system ones, of which there could be a number, are working together and harmoniously to deliver services, so they're not tripping over each other or contradicting each other or whatever. And then there are communication channels between these parts of the system to maintain awareness of itself and to help maintain the coherence and cohesion of the whole system, so that no one part of it is going off on its own and disrupting the whole system. And the couple of key sort of aspects of this are that the system ones, so the parts of the system that actually deliver what the whole thing is there to do, have responsible autonomy to get on and do what they need to do, and they have the resources to do it. And they are sort of managed, if you like, through performance measures, which are fed back to the management, so that they can be clear that that system is achieving what we intend for it to achieve. So there's a bargaining process between the management and the operational areas to say, this is what we're charged with doing, these are the resources we need to do it, and this is the performance that we will deliver for you on that basis. So that's sort of how and that's all in the context of its environment, by the way. So, you can't define those things without acknowledging the environment that the service or organisation exists in. And then another key concept is recursion, and this is what where it can sort of get confusing. But if we think of it in terms of a real situation, our health system is sort of set up in that way anyway. So, and that it decomposes down into, from the national level to a regional, to a district, to there are hospitals within districts, and then they have divisions and departments and services and so on. So you can see that sort of unfolding of complexity down through the system. What would make that function much more effectively, if we apply the viable system model to that, then you would say at each one of those levels, all of those 5 functions would be operating. So it's not that you have governance at the top and management in the middle and then operations, down in the delivery as such. But at each level, those 5 functions need to be working. And so at the very top level, at Health New Zealand, for instance, in terms of the governance function, there is a board, and some of those high level functions, you will have sort of more people involved in them, but it will decompose down until you get down to the actual delivery of services. So let's say an ophthalmology service, it also needs to have a governance function. It needs to know what its purpose is and the values and so on that it works to. It needs to manage itself. It needs to understand what's happening in the environment that it might need to adjust to, and then deliver services. But the emphasis as you go down through the levels, down through the levels, you get a narrower scope to be covered, but in greater detail. And so it's not that the lower levels are less important than the ones above, but they are dealing with a different level of detail. And so if you allow the right level of autonomy at each of those levels, then you're dealing with issues as close to the issue itself as possible. So what we have currently in the system is that so much is controlled by the centre, and there's so little autonomy at the lower levels that the whole system becomes sort of mired in bureaucracy. And one example that was given to me, well, there were two actually, was that to replace a $150 piece of equipment, $150, a request had to go all the way up through the levels to Wellington. And then another one was having gone through the process to recruit a clinical staff member from overseas, because there was no one here. It took so long to get the final approval that by the time it came from Wellington, the person that they were going to recruit was gone, had given up and gone on to some other thing. So, those attempts at, where there's over control in the name of, sort of making the system more efficient, actually makes it less efficient and mires it in bureaucracy.
It's really, really helpful overview, and I did really like how you pulled it apart and sort of connected it to those different, I guess, layers, from a national view, a regional view, maybe a hospital view, and then even a department view. You have those 5 systems. That's System 5, governance; System 4, planning; Systems 3, management; Systems 2, coordination; and Systems 1, operations. I wondered if we could maybe go back to that ophthalmology place, and it could just be used as an example of what it would look like in that maybe department, say, to implement something like this. What I'm imagining is that System 1 operations are those, clinicians sort of doing the doing and some of the support that sits around them. What I'm also imagining is that coordination function is not necessarily explicitly, defined and supported. It feels like System 3 of management, System 2 of coordination, and a bit of System 1 in the current approach is just mashed together, and maybe that management layer just gets lumped with just way too much without any, support and clear kind of, definitional boundaries. So I've said a little bit there, but maybe if you could reflect on, firstly, what you observed. I know in your PhD you wrote about things like a black hole of activity and consumption of service managers getting consumed by the chaos of the day-to-day, which absolutely resonated with me. Maybe we could start with one of those problems you observed, and then the next piece would be, cool, we've got this great approach. What does it look like to apply it to maybe a department?
Okay, those everything collapses, it seems, into System 3, the top level functions, because there is no time really for thinking about our purpose and our identity, and certainly not for looking at long term. That all gets sort of mushed into management, and then you're absolutely right that the absence of the recognition of coordination as a function in its own right, I think, is absolutely critical. And if we could address that problem, we would be well on the way to making the system more effective and efficient. And so System 2, just to be clear, is about taking all the standards and the sort of rules of the game that have been set, by the managers, and understanding what the parameters of delivery of service are, and orchestrating those so that we get the right patients in front of the right clinicians, in the order, in the time that they should be seen, and so on, for service delivery. And so it includes things like, prioritized wait list, rosters, clinic schedules, a skills matrix. We need to have training of staff, lots of other things. And it needs to be supported and function through integrated and effective IT systems to make this work. What currently happens is that so much of it is manual, or it might be done through spreadsheets, or there might be different schedules about the place that then need to be brought together manually. So they not only then are prone to error, but they take a lot of time. So that the huge issue is the lack of recognition of that coordination as a function. To be able to set that up as a function, then we need the detail of understanding of our delivery in terms of how we deliver services. And so I call that opaque operations. We do things, and services are delivered, but we're not as crystal clear as we need to be about exactly what's required and how we do that. And I think, as we sort of talked about earlier, and then if you get that clarity, you can then start to implement a proper coordination function. And also, if you have that clarity around that, those System 1 service delivery areas, you can start to look for synergies between them, and how can we look at ways to make these services perhaps work better together and more efficiently. And then because we don't have these things working properly, as you said, the management function gets consumed by the chaos of the day-to-day, because the System 2 should coordinate the day-to-day. So we should have set up all the rules for how that happens, and that System 2 function should help just that work on a day-to-day basis. But it doesn't, and it throws up all sorts of issues. So the System 3 function is then consumed by, what's slipped into that black hole of activity. And also because we don't have the support services aligned with towards service delivery, so support services like people and capability, IT, finance, for instance, because their efforts are not perhaps sufficient and not aligned enough towards service delivery, then the service manager and clinical director might spend a whole lot of their time trying to get those things lined up. And so they just get in this sort of tumble dryer or whirlpool of trying to deal with day-to-day stuff, and trying to do longer term or more substantial issues, and really not being able to make traction. And in the meantime, everybody's frustrated with the lack of functioning of the system.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the sort of capability building and sort of training elements to this, because one viewpoint could be, well, people just need more training, send someone off on a course and hey presto, we've sorted it, versus the the literal structuring of departments and definitions of functions. I just wondered if you could comment on is it sort of swinging in both directions or in other directions? What's your take on that kind of like training element?
So training on its own is not going to be enough, because you could take people away and they might get some leadership training, or they might get management training, and I'm sure they get, well, I'm not sure, but I hope they get a bit of each, I guess. But then they come back into a system that is chaotic, and they don't necessarily have the time or the influence to be able to implement the sorts of things that they might need to. So until there's if there were recognition of the usefulness of something like the viable system model and how it can be applied to provide a common language and framework for how we organise ourselves across the system, then you could provide some. And if we accepted that, we might want to organise ourselves that way, then at least if people go off and get training, and when they come back, there's sort of an established an approach and way of doing things and a way of moving towards this more sort of coherent way of functioning, rather than just stepping back into the chaos of the day-to-day. And it's all very well to have learned some stuff, but if you can't apply it, then what was the point?
Yeah, and it's an easy way to also disengage and sort of almost disassociate from the work in a certain sense, because you're in the chaos. Maybe you get this nice leadership training, and then straight back into the system that caused all the problems, and doesn't make for a culture that perhaps even attracts great people and holds on to them, right? To recruit it and therefore part of that recruitment to retain, because there is so much tacit knowledge that's built up over time, discretionary effort that we are sort of not tapping into, because we set up systems that ultimately fail people who are trying to do their best. I think there is something here, though, that maybe a critic might say as well. Like, are you just asking for more managers, more administrators? Is that not just more bureaucracy and cost, and maybe clinicians seeing less patients because they're spending time in these meetings trying to refine things instead of seeing patients?
I think it's the opposite, actually, and that reminds me of one point I needed to make about the viable system model, is that the structure of it describes functions that need to happen, not roles on an organisation chart. So you're not suddenly increasing the amount of management that you need to have for a service. You're just identifying the key functions that need to be happening within a service that need to be attended to. And so it's, by the time you get down to clinical service delivery, at the level of a service like ophthalmology, for example, some of the same people will be doing performing a number of those functions, or will be involved in a number of those functions. So for the System 4 strategy and planning, for instance, it might likely be the clinical director and the service manager sort of involved in that, with input from other support services, decision support and finance and so on. And they will also, so there's a mechanism to make that function happen. We need to address the function. We need to understand the mechanisms through which it will happen. But really, this is not about increasing the bureaucracy. It's about decreasing it, in fact, over the system as a whole, giving more autonomy to people to actually get on and do what they need to do, but also recognising that we could be much more efficient if we had a system an approach or a way of conceptualising the system that underpinned the efforts that are taken, because so many of the efforts that are taken at the moment are wasted because they're not orchestrated, and so people are redoing things. They're fixing issues that really shouldn't have happened if we had more deliberately thought about how we function, from the start.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I mean, I'll be honest, I was imagining, individual people and groups and very sort of segregated across those layers, the sandwich of VSM. And that's really helpful to know that there is a maybe more of a fluid flow, and it's about the, I guess, responsibilities of those functions as opposed to, direct specifics. I wanted to go to, and you touched on this earlier, but I wanted to go to that interface between this. I think I can conceptualize the VSM. Well, I definitely can actually in a hospital department, but I'd be curious to know that interface to that next layer. Maybe it's maybe it's the hospital as a whole, or the region. How does the information flow across those levels? Is it system 5 feeding into the system 1, and there's multiple feeds into that system 1 of the next layer, or how does it look?
So so the system 3 function, the one that we've identified as consumed by chaos, and is actually critical because it sits at the intersect of the levels, and it's the job of that system 3 function to can't think of the word, but anyway, to present to the level above their service, the value they provide, the resources they need, and so on. And so that's the sort of key link between the levels. And there's to establish that link, the levels are sort of interpenetrated, if you like, in that, and it's easy to think of a real example. So if we think of surgical services in a hospital, and there are a number of those, and they each have a clinical director, and so they're the system 1s for surgical services. When at the level of surgical services as a whole, they're making decisions about what needs to happen. The clinical directors and probably service managers of the system 1s, in other words, of the surgical services themselves, of urology, of ophthalmology, of general surgery, are part of the management function of the level above. In other words, they contribute to the thinking and the prioritization of activities and so on at that level. And so and the same between perhaps the divisions in a hospital and the hospital level as a whole, or between hospitals in the region, so that we overcome the separation between the levels. And to some extent those things were happening, but the other key point to note is that there are certain decisions that are best made at each level. So your ophthalmology service is not going to be deciding about whether we need a new hospital in the South Island, for instance. That's a decision for higher up. And so being clear about the mechanisms, the decision-making mechanisms we put in place, and the decisions that they are there to deal with, means that they don't get bogged down in sort of lower level things that bubble up because we haven't been clear about what we're doing at this level. And related to that, to avoid those lower level decisions sort of bubbling up, is if you give the lower levels more autonomy to deal with their own issues, then they don't bubble up. So again, you're making the system more deliberate and efficient because you're you're not clogging it up, clogging up sort of those high level mechanisms with low level problems, because we've understood the difference, and we've given autonomy to the lower levels to sort them out.
Yeah, and I like what you said earlier in our conversation about the sort of narrowness but deepness and I would say richness of those lower levels understanding their problems. And I think what I like also about this is this creates, a trust framework for
Yes.
people in their respective areas of expertise up and down the chain of this structure to deliver to their best in a very clear and concerted way, and then having that recursive nature an element to it, such that this is about being a learning system that has feed forward and feedback type mechanisms that are explicit. I think that's really powerful, particularly for those clinicians on the front line feeling like they just have very little say or control, and equally, sometimes clinicians, our areas of expertise are in seeing patients, and so
Yes.
our ability to advocate and sit those levels can be a real challenge. And I think this opens up that opportunity to enhance that voice, but equally for us to learn the constraints that their managers and the administrators had, and for us to be asked hard questions, right? We want to see everybody. We want to give them the best quality care, but we do not have unlimited resources. And the way we apply our resources can be unfair. So, what are the approaches that we are collaboratively making? Because, again, sometimes clinicians, we can feel like it's always on our shoulders.
Yes.
Or that we don't work in a system, that we just work one-on-one, but actually the decisions we make, that extra 5 hips on the Friday afternoon, actually has implications for the Monday morning list. And until we kind of have that space and time to engage with those problems and that complexity, it is always going to create friction, and we're always going to struggle to progress.
Yes, and I think that the interpenetration of the levels that I was talking about helps to raise the awareness of clinicians about the issues that are dealt with higher up, but it also helps the people higher up understand, what clinicians are dealing with, and so to have that collaborative discussion. And a couple of things around that. I always think of Lord Darcy's comment in a 2008 white paper from the NHS that basically said that if clinicians are to be held accountable for the quality of care they deliver, then they should have some say in the resources that they need to do that. And so this helps to address that problem. Also, when I was working with ophthalmology, the clinical director suggested, in line with the VSM, and it was before, I think, in fact, we got to the VSM, that that there be a clinical director, not a clinical director, a specialist, an ophthalmologist in charge of each of the clinical delivery streams. And so that they could start to take responsibility for that and start to understand what some of the challenges are, and making decisions about getting through the volumes that they have. And the comment was made that it wasn't until that happened that one of the specialists started to understand the constraints and started then to think differently. He said, well, we can't ask for all of this because these are the impacts of it. So let's think differently about this problem. And so it does come back to that, collaborative working and understanding and trust as well, to get through some of these problems and get beyond that. This is sort of order of, you will do this and don't tell me why you can't.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful example, because I think, leaders, managers, those who are also working quite close to the front line, it can feel like they are taking all of this on themselves. But actually, you can build a better team environment, better relationships and understanding through what you've said, right? Like, who in our team, can take on understanding a particular value stream, and then bring it back to the group, and how can we help then digest it and articulate those services, as opposed to, well, now I'm the clinical director, I need to do all this for all the work that we're doing. And I think there is something about that delegation skill, as well as an empowerment, right? Because I think for all of us working on the front line, we do want to create the tools to understand our environment, and too often we can just be excluded from that. And so I think that's a helpful step in that direction, which follows on from a question that I was keen to ask you. One part of this is a more global, perhaps transformational view on a health system. Another way is, is there a bottom-up approach, some key principles or steps, which I think you've just articulated, that can help us move in that direction. I know you also mentioned really defining and resourcing and supporting that coordination function, sort of the lubricant in the machine between those various areas. I wondered if you had any other thoughts on how a system can move in this VSM direction.
Well, I think it could be seen as a massive task, or we could say actually, the elements of it are quite straightforward when you think about it. They're not odd concepts that that people are going to struggle to grasp, and it wouldn't take much effort to get teams at the clinical delivery level to start to think about these concepts and think about what information they do have and what they don't have and where they have gaps and how they can start to make more sense of and construct their understanding and their conceptualization of their service using this model. And so, that could throw up a whole lot of things that people learn and can help improve the way we do things. But having things happen just at that level, wouldn't be enough. And because you end up in this sort of space, challenging space where we did, which is, you need input from finance and HR and IT and perhaps decision support and production planning to help create the mechanisms to make this work. And that part of the reason that we couldn't get the time of production planning was because they were dealing with a service by service, because each service has a completely different way of conceptualizing how it functions. If it does conceptualize how it functions, then every time they go into a service, they kind of have to start from scratch. Whereas we can say, let's build up here the kind of basic common framework for understanding the factors that we need for production planning, and then take a much more sort of efficient approach to doing that. But you do need input from those other levels to really get that working. But I think there are ways of doing that. It's not that people have none of this; they have parts of it, and by helping people to work together, to pull together what they do have, we can start to look at where we can make progress and where we have gaps to fill.
Yeah, so I was reflecting when I was doing research for this conversation. I was looking at the VSM diagram, which I just really, really struggled with. And it wasn't until watching a YouTube video about this application in actual product management that it really clicked for me. And the way that it clicked for me was recently I've been a product manager. And for those who aren't familiar with that role, it's a role where you sort of bridge a technical and product team. They're building an application, an app on your phone or what have you, and you bridge that with customers and senior stakeholders in a broader organization. And that was my role for over 12 months. And this model is actually layered onto the work that we're doing. Just system one, that sort of delivery point, that operations delivery point, when we were building new features, this is how you input data or capture data or what have you, that would go out to our users and we would get feedback. We would have the system 2 coordination, where we have daily stand-ups and huddles. We have what's called a Kanban board for tracking activity. We would have scrums, things like that common product circles for defining what you're going to do and sizing it and then delivering. And then at system 3, that management level is where I sat between there and system 4. System 3 with a lot of planning, the creation of user stories, which is a description of what the problem is you're trying to solve. And then at that system 4 level is that strategy, innovation level, where we would have the overarching product strategy. And that's where we would meet with other business stakeholders to understand their product direction, as well as external environmental pressures. So we have health targets in New Zealand, and so that was a big part of how we were planning to deliver and how we defined what we did. And then on top of that, System 5, which is that governance level where we had our senior technical and business stakeholders feeding into us our direction of travel and supporting any challenging decisions that we had. So I bring that up just to share, a light switch for me where we were probably imperfectly, but elements of what we were doing sat inside the system and in my opinion, works really well. Yes, there were some areas for improvement, but it's a system that's live and doing good things out in the world.
And now that you've got it in your head, you won't get rid of it. So I'm kind of glad about that. Yeah. But it does help you in any kind of situation if you kind of run through in your head, we're not addressing this coordination function, or we're not actually thinking, we're so busy in the minutiae of what we're doing, we're not thinking about, what might be coming in and so on. And so if you could just, quickly run through in your mind and how information is being fed around that system, you can apply it at all sorts of places. And now when I hear of any sort of situation, I think about whether or not, there is cybernetics at play. So I was watching a documentary on a murder investigation, and when you think of the effort that goes into investigating a murder, it's a lot of effort, a lot of people, huge expense. And what they're typically doing is, following a lead, gathering information. What is this telling us? Actually, this is a dead end. You're learning all the time, and then going back and then learning about something else, so that they're always gathering information, testing, feeding back, learning, adapting, moving until they get towards their absolute goal. So you do start to see, cybernetics and the VSM in play in all sorts of places.
Yeah, and when I was thinking about this very simplistically, was just thinking of two nodes feeding information from one to another. One of those nodes is interacting with the outside world and changing and adapting to that outside world input, and then we know in systems you put something in the middle of that, and kind of like that's where we've kind of gotten to. We've gotten the top node, which is that governance layer, a middle node of management, and then that bottom node, which is kind of like the doing thing. And I think if you just take that one step further, you my words, lubricate that connection between that operating node and the management node, and then you put in one further node between the governance and the management for that sort of strategy planning, sort of future focused type thinking. And I think that's been helpful for me, just to almost think of it like a organism or an ecosystem sort of evolving and adapting to the environment and getting a bit more sophisticated with how it more effectively delivers. And there's a lot in effective delivery, right? That is lowering the energy required, that's lowering the complexity and the cost, and also enhancing the outputs.
And just one thing, when you're thinking of so much of this is about information and communication, the right information at the right level in the right format and so on. And developing IT systems, they've developed hugely, and they will continue to develop at pace, but we won't be able to make use of those and take advantage of those if we don't understand our actual business properly, if we don't understand our service delivery. And then when you do get to this, the point where the IT people understand what's possible, you understand what you need, you can have this, what's called a sort of dance of agency, where the business people say, this is what we need, this is what we're trying to achieve. The IT people say, yes, we can do that, but have you thought of this? We can actually do that as well. And then the business people say, oh, well, if you can do that, we can look at things differently and so on. And if one or other of those two sides is not clear about what it's trying to achieve, especially I think it's been the case that the IT side will have the tools and the technology to do all sorts of things, but if the business itself can't keep up, it will either find that it's having IT systems thrust upon it that it doesn't really need or aren't helpful, and that it can't really sort of really take advantage of what's available because if the service isn't really clear about its functioning. Yeah.
All right, Dr. Sharen Paine, this has been a real pleasure. I have thoroughly enjoyed this. Coming full circle back to my comments around being in a large organisation, feeling like the structures have been there forever, then going through a restructure and sort of trying to piece together the why of how it all comes together, and still struggling with that. This has given me a vastly stronger framework to apply that in, to identify those gaps and better understand the role of management too. Coming into understanding the importance of management is, I'll be honest, I've only really started to think about it in the last couple of years, and I thought of it in a very narrow lens of, the big buckets of the difference between leadership and management. And you've given me further sort of strings to that bow of understanding those different components and how that they actually need their own feeding and watering to thrive across one another. So just want to say a big thank you. I'll be linking a lot of your work in the podcast comment section, and a big thank you for your time.
Thank you for taking interest in this rather seemingly obscure area. Yeah.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of the podcast. I want to thank you for making it all the way to the end, and I really appreciate your time. If you want to help us out, write us a review or share it with a friend. And if you want to learn more, go to the Clinical Changemakers podcast website, www.clinicalchangemakers.com. Take care.